Japan's early Pacific offensives in the immediate aftermath of the surprise attack on Pearl Harbor. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a sweeping campaign of conquest across the Pacific and Southeast Asia. These were not haphazard assaults, the execution of a calculated military strategy designed to seize vital territory, secure crucial natural resources, and establish a formidable defensive perimeter. Japan's high command aimed to build an empire that would be self-sufficient, a strong and tough Greater East Asia co-prosperity sphere that spanned thousands of miles of ocean and jungle, ready for anything. Within hours of bombing Pearl Harbor, Japanese forces struck the Philippines. American and Filipino defenders, led by General Douglas MacArthur, were unprepared for the speed and coordination of the assault. Despite mounting a stubborn defense, Allied troops were gradually pushed back. In January 1942, Manila fell. Those who remained retreated to the Bataan Peninsula and the island stronghold of Corregidor. They endured relentless bombardment and shortages of food and medicine. After months of grueling siege, Bataan surrendered in April. What followed became one of the darkest chapters in the War the Bataan Death March. Approximately 76,000 American and Filipino prisoners of war were forced to march over 60 miles under the tropical sun, subjected to beatings, starvation, and summary executions. Thousands perished along the way. Simultaneously, Japan unleashed its army on British-held Malaya. In a bold and unexpected move, Japanese forces advanced from the north through Thailand, bypassing British naval defenses. British commanders had anticipated a sea-based invasion and were unprepared for Japan's rapid overland approach. Utilizing bicycles and light transport to move swiftly through the dense jungle, the Japanese overwhelmed British, Indian, and Australian forces. In just over 2 months, they had captured the entire Malayan Peninsula. The fall of Singapore on February 15, 1942, once hailed as the Gibraltar of the East, was a devastating blow to British imperial pride. In just 1 week of fierce fighting, more than 80,000 Allied troops surrendered, marking what Prime Minister Winston Churchill would later describe as the worst disaster in British military history. Elsewhere, the Japanese war machine pressed forward. In the Dutch East Indies, Japan targeted the region's abundant oil, rubber, and tin resources vital to its war effort. Despite efforts by a combined Allied naval force to resist, including American, British, Dutch, and Australian ships, the Japanese overwhelmed them in engagements such as the Battle of the Java Sea. One by one, key islands fell into Japanese hands. Burma became another front in Japan's bid for dominance. Japanese forces swept westward toward British India, aiming to sever the Burma Road, the last remaining supply line to nationalist China. The harsh terrain of jungle and mountains, combined with torrential rains and rampant disease, made the campaign especially brutal for both sides. Yet Japan's advance proved initially unstoppable. The Allied retreat into India marked another low point in the war's early months. Meanwhile, across the scattered islands of the Pacific, Japanese forces quickly captured Guam, Wake Island, the Gilbert Islands, and others. Each conquest further extended their defensive perimeter and added to their strategic depth. Within 6 months of Pearl Harbor, Japan had constructed a vast empire stretching from the Aleutian Islands in the north to the Solomon Islands in the south, and from the borders of India in the west to the Central Pacific in the east. What made these offensives so devastatingly effective was Japan's seamless coordination between land, sea, and air forces, along with an aggressive doctrine that emphasized speed, surprise, and shock. Japanese pilots, sailors, and infantry operated with precision and confidence, often overwhelming their opponents before they could organize a coherent defense. But Japan's rapid expansion came at a cost. Their forces were now spread thin across an enormous area. Supply lines were overextended, and each new conquest added to the logistical burden. Occupied populations harbored deep resentment. The initial tide of victory masked the underlying weaknesses of Japan's position. The early months of 1942 were marked by Allied shock, retreat, and defeat, but also by determination. As Japan reached the height of its territorial expansion, cracks began to form. The string of victories would soon meet stiff resistance, and the seeds of reversal were already being sown. From the coral atolls of Midway to the jungles of Guadalcanal, The Allies were preparing to strike back. Pearl Harbor. The day that changed the world. December 7th, on the tranquil morning of Sunday. December 7th, 1941, the Hawaiian Islands awoke under a clear sky. But by 7:48 a.m., that calm was shattered by the thunderous roar of incoming aircraft. Wave after wave of Japanese warplanes, more than 350 in total, swept down upon the U.S. naval base at Pearl Harbor, unleashing devastation without warning. In less than 2 hours, bombs and torpedoes wreaked havoc on the unsuspecting fleet. Battleships were torn apart, destroyers engulfed in flames, airfields laid to waste. The USS Arizona took a direct hit to its ammunition magazine, erupting in a catastrophic explosion that sent the vessel to the bottom of the harbor, entombing over 1,100 sailors. The USS Oklahoma capsized, trapping hundreds inside. Fires raged. Black smoke curled into the sky. The deafening blasts of bombs and machine gun fire mixed with the cries of the wounded and dying. By the time the assault ended, more than 2,400 Americans had been killed. Nearly 1,200 more lay wounded. A critical portion of the Pacific Fleet was either sunk or severely damaged. The base, once a symbol of American presence in the Pacific, had become a scene of ruin and disbelief. The attack was not just a surprise, it was a meticulously planned offensive, designed by Japanese military strategists to cripple America's ability to project power in the Pacific. They hoped a swift, decisive strike would buy them time to consolidate territorial gains across Southeast Asia and the Pacific Rim, free from American interference. But what the Japanese command failed to anticipate was the fury their assault would ignite. The very next day, December 8th, President Franklin D. Roosevelt stood before a joint session of Congress and delivered one of the most iconic speeches in American history. He called December 7th a date which will live in infamy. Only one dissenting vote stood against the tide of national outrage. Just 3 days later, on December 11th, Germany and Italy, Japan's allies and the Axis powers, declared war on the United States. America, no longer able to remain on the sidelines, responded in kind. What had begun as isolated conflicts in Europe and Asia had now merged into a single, all-encompassing global war. In the wake of Pearl Harbor, the United States transformed overnight. Across the country, factories switched from civilian production to war materiel. Tanks, planes, and ammunition rolled off assembly lines at an unprecedented pace. Young men flooded enlistment centers. Women joined the workforce in droves. The entire nation mobilized. Pearl Harbor had not broken the American spirit, it galvanized it. What was once a reluctant nation now stood unified, determined to confront the forces of tyranny on two fronts. From the blood-stained waters of Oahu to the beaches of Normandy and the jungles of the Pacific. The course of history had shifted. A new chapter had begun, one written in courage, sacrifice, and the unwavering resolve of a nation awakened. In the autumn of 1941, German Wehrmacht reached the gates of Leningrad, a city of immense cultural, industrial, and symbolic significance to the Soviet Union. Rather than risk high casualties in a direct assault, Adolf Hitler chose a different path: total encirclement and deliberate starvation. The objective was not merely conquest, it was extermination. Hitler ordered that the city be wiped from the face of the earth. No surrender would be accepted. No mercy offered. The people of Leningrad were to die. Thus began one of the longest and most brutal sieges in the history of warfare. From September 8, 1941, to January 27, 1944, a span of 872 days. Leningrad was cut off from the rest of the Soviet Union. German and Finnish forces encircled the city, severing rail lines, destroying roads, and halting all food and fuel shipments. Over 3 million people, including 400,000 children, were trapped within its boundaries as winter approached. What followed was a humanitarian catastrophe of epic proportions. Food supplies dwindled rapidly. By the winter of 1941-1942, rations fell to as low as 125 grams of bread per day apiece, no larger than a matchbox, often stretched with sawdust or wallpaper paste. People boiled leather boots, belts, and even furniture glue to make a thin broth. Pets disappeared, so did birds. Some turned to cannibalism. Death became a daily reality on trams, in stairwells, in the streets. Entire families froze to death in their apartments, unable to afford firewood. Corpses were left lying in snowbanks for days, uncollected. Despite the overwhelming suffering, Leningrad refused to surrender. The city endured, not only through its will to survive, but through an extraordinary commitment to culture and resistance. Bombarded daily by artillery and Luftwaffe air raids, Leningrad's factories kept producing tanks, rifles, and shells. Schools continued to teach. Museums preserved their treasures. Writers, poets, and musicians chronicled the agony and heroism of life under siege. When one of the most powerful cultural moments of the war, composer Dmitri Shostakovich wrote his Seventh Symphony during the siege, completed amid the bombings and starvation. It was performed in the city in August 1942 by a depleted orchestra, many of whom were so weak they could barely lift their instruments. The performance was broadcast throughout the city and, even towards German lines, via loudspeakers as a defiant act of survival and spirit. The only tenuous link to the outside world was the Road of Life, a supply route that crossed the frozen surface of Lake Ladoga. During the winters, convoys of trucks, sleds, and even civilians on foot or ice skates risked everything to deliver food and evacuate the sick. German artillery and aircraft constantly targeted the ice road, and countless lives were lost in the freezing waters. Yet without it, the city would have perished entirely. The Soviet Red Army made repeated and costly attempts to break the siege. These offensives, though often bloody and unsuccessful at first, helped prevent complete encirclement. Finally, in January 1944, after more than 2 years of relentless suffering, Soviet forces succeeded in pushing the Germans back and liberated the city. What they found was a city hollowed by hunger, but unbroken in spirit. Over 1 million civilians are estimated to have died, most from starvation and cold rather than combat, yet Leningrad endured. Survival became a defining symbol of Soviet resilience, sacrifice, and cultural pride. The Siege of Leningrad stands as one of the darkest episodes of World War II, not just for its cruelty, but for the extraordinary endurance it revealed in those who lived through it. It was a war not just of bullets and bombs, but of willpower, creativity, and human dignity. In the face of calculated annihilation, Leningrad remained defiant, a city that refused to die. The Battle of El Alamein was a critical turning point in the North African campaign of World War II. It's taking place between October 23rd and November 11th, 1942. It marked the first major Allied victory against the Axis powers on land. Before this battle, the German Afrika Korps, under Field Marshal Erwin Rommel, had made significant advances across North Africa, threatening Egypt and, by extension, the Suez Canal, a vital artery for Allied supply lines. By mid-1942, Rommel's forces had pushed the British Eighth Army back to a defensive line near El Alamein. It's just 66 miles from Alexandria. The British, under the command of General Bernard Montgomery, decided to make a stand. Montgomery had spent months building up his forces, stockpiling weapons, fuel, and food. While also improving morale and discipline among his troops, he understood that the battle had to be a decisive blow, not a temporary setback for the Axis. The battle began with a massive artillery bombardment, followed by a coordinated infantry and armored assault. The desert terrain was harsh, filled with minefields, barbed wire, and fortified Axis positions. Rommel, known as the Desert Fox for his tactical brilliance, was not present during the early days of the battle due to illness, which may have affected the Axis response. Still, the fighting was intense and bloody, with both sides suffering heavy casualties. Over several days, Montgomery's methodical strategy of attrition wore down the Axis defenses. British forces systematically breached minefields, nicknamed the Devil's Gardens, and outmaneuvered German and Italian units. By early November, Rommel realized his forces were outnumbered, outgunned, and on the verge of encirclement. He ordered a retreat westward toward Tunisia. The victory at El Alamein was more than just a battlefield success. It ended the string of Axis victories in North Africa and marked the beginning of a broader Allied offensive. Winston Churchill famously declared, "Before Alamein, we never had a victory. After Alamein, we never had a defeat." The psychological boost it gave to the Allies was immense. and it set the stage for the Allied invasion of North Africa in Operation Torch. Just days later, the tide of the war in Africa had definitively turned. In June 1942, just 6 months after the devastating attack on Pearl Harbor, the United States and Japan clashed in what would become one of the most pivotal and consequential naval battles in world history, the Battle of Midway. The Japanese Imperial Navy, seeking to deal a final blow to American sea power in the Pacific, launched a bold offensive aimed at capturing Midway Atoll, a small but strategically vital outpost northwest of Hawaii. Their ultimate goal was clear: lure out and destroy the remaining U.S. aircraft carriers, eliminate American resistance in the Pacific, and solidify their dominance over the entire region. But the plan, though ambitious, harbored a fatal flaw. Was no longer a secret. American cryptanalysts, led by Commander Joseph Rochefort and his team at Station HYPO, had successfully broken portions of Japan's naval code. Through careful analysis and deception, they confirmed that AFO, the Japanese target, referred to Midway. Armed with this knowledge, Admiral Chester W. Nimitz, Commander-in-Chief of the U.S. Pacific Fleet, devised a counter-strategy that would turn the trap back on its makers. Nimitz placed his trust in 3 U.S. carriers, USS Yorktown, and USS Hornetown, moved them into position northeast of Midway, lying in wait beyond the horizon. Unlike at Pearl Harbor, this time the Americans would not be caught off guard. On the morning of June 4, 1942, Japanese carrier aircraft launched a powerful aerial assault on Midway Island, heavily bombing its defenses, believing the American fleet was still far away. Admiral Isoroku Yamamoto and his subordinates remained unaware that their own carriers were under threat. As Japanese aircraft returned to refuel and rearm for a second strike on Midway, American planes launched from both Midway itself and the nearby carriers began their own attacks. The first wave of U.S. torpedo bombers, flying slow and without fighter cover, suffered horrific losses. Entire squadrons were wiped out, with aircraft being shot down before they could even get within striking range. But these doomed attacks served a greater purpose. They distracted the Japanese combat air patrol, drawing fighters to low altitudes and forcing chaos on deck crews, who scrambled to rearm and refuel planes with bombs and torpedoes. Then, just before 10 a.m., American dive bombers from the Enterprise in Yorktown arrived high above the Japanese fleet. With the enemy's fighters out of position and the decks cluttered with fueled aircraft and ordnance, the timing was perfect. In a matter of minutes, 3 Japanese carriers, Kagi, Kaga, and Soryu, were turned into flaming wrecks, engulfed in fire and black smoke. Hours later, the 4th and final carrier, Hiryu, launched a retaliatory strike that badly damaged the Yorktown, but she too was soon discovered and sunk by American aircraft. The cost to Japan was staggering. Over 3,000 men lost, including many of their most experienced naval aviators, for fleet carriers destroyed, and hundreds of irreplaceable aircraft lost. In contrast, the U.S. suffered the loss of the Yorktown and approximately 300 personnel, a serious blow, but one they could recover from. The Battle of Midway was more than just a tactical victory, it was a strategic turning point. Up until that moment, Japan had been on the offensive, sweeping through the Pacific with relentless momentum. But Midway shattered the myth of Japanese naval invincibility and crippled their ability to wage offensive war. From that day on, the initiative in the Pacific shifted to the United States. In the months and years that followed, American forces would launch a relentless island-hopping campaign, recapturing territory one atoll, one jungle, one beachhead at a time, pushing ever closer to the Japanese homeland. The lessons of Midway echoed throughout the war. The decisive role of intelligence, the dominance of carrier-based aviation, and the strategic impact of bold, higher-risk decisions. Midway proved that the tide of war could turn, not through sheer numbers, but through foresight, courage, and the willingness to act on uncertain intelligence. In the vast expanse of the Pacific, in just a few hours of combat, the balance of power shifted, and the road to ultimate victory for the Allies began. The Guadalcanal Campaign was one of the first major offensives by Allied forces against the Japanese Empire in the Pacific theater, and it marked a turning point in World War II. It began in August 1942, just months after the pivotal Battle of Midway, and represented the start of the United States strategy of island hopping, seizing strategic islands and using them as stepping stones to move closer to Japan. The Guadalcanal itself is one of the Solomon Islands in the South Pacific. The Japanese had begun constructing an airfield there, which posed a serious threat to Allied supply and communication lines between the United States, Australia, and New Zealand. American planners quickly realized the strategic importance of the island and launched a surprise amphibious assault to capture it. On August 7, 1942, U.S. Marines landed on the island, catching the Japanese off guard. Initially, the invasion went relatively smoothly, with the Marines quickly seizing the unfinished airfield, later named Henderson Field. But what followed was 6 months of brutal combat both on land and at sea. The Japanese launched repeated attempts to retake the island, leading to a series of deadly naval battles, including the Battle of Savo Island, the Battle of Cape Esperance, and the naval Battle of Guadalcanal. Both sides suffered heavy losses, especially in night engagements where the Japanese Navy initially had the upper hand. On land, the Americans faced fierce resistance, difficult jungle terrain, and supply shortages. The Japanese launched repeated assaults on the marine perimeter around Henderson Field, often fighting to the death. Disease, especially malaria and dysentery, plagued both sides and became as much an enemy as the opposing soldiers. As the campaign dragged on into late 1942 and early 1943, the tide began to turn. The United States managed to reinforce its troops and secure naval dominance in the surrounding waters. By February 1943, the Japanese made the difficult decision to evacuate their remaining forces from the island. Marking the first major strategic defeat for Japan in the Pacific War, the victory at Guadalcanal had enormous significance, shattered the myth of Japanese invincibility, gave the Allies a crucial foothold in the Pacific, and boosted morale at a critical time. It also signaled a shift in momentum from defensive battles to a long, grinding Allied advance across the Pacific toward Japan. The lessons learned at Guadalcanal, in logistics jungle warfare, and amphibious warfare operations would shape the rest of the Pacific campaign. Allied bombing campaigns in Europe. Throughout World War II, the Allied bombing campaigns in Europe played a crucial role in weakening Nazi Germany's ability to sustain its war effort. These campaigns began in earnest in 1940 and escalated dramatically after the United States entered the war in 1941. The British Royal Air Force RAF initially focused on precision bombing, but quickly shifted to area bombing under Air Chief Marshal Arthur Harris. But soon they became networks of defiance, sabotage, and survival. These were not organized armies with uniforms and tanks, but farmers, students, teachers, and workers, all risking everything to fight back, from the forests of Poland to the streets of Paris. They operated in shadows, hiding weapons, smuggling information, derailing trains, and assassinating collaborators. In France, the resistance grew from underground newspapers and small sabotage acts into a full-fledged force that would one day rise to assist the Allies during the liberation. In the Soviet Union, partisan fighters waged a brutal guerrilla war behind German lines, disrupting supply chains and harassing retreating forces. In Yugoslavia, Tito's partisans became a powerful army in their own right, fiercely battling the Axis and eventually playing a decisive role in liberating the region. Behind the scenes, two newly formed intelligence agencies, the British Special Operations Executive, SOE, the American Office of Strategic Services, OSS, were orchestrating much of the covert war. The SOE, famously instructed by Churchill to set Europe ablaze, trained agents to infiltrate enemy territory, organize resistance cells, and carry out sabotage missions. These operatives parachuted into France, Norway, Greece, and beyond, often working with locals and relying on coded radio messages and secret drop zones. The OSS, precursor to the CIA, coordinated with the SOE and local resistance movements, gathering intelligence, sabotaging enemy operations, and planning psychological warfare. They recruited a diverse mix of linguists, scientists, escape artists, and even Hollywood filmmakers to help craft deceptive operations. Many of these missions were dangerous, and the cost was often high. Captured agents were tortured and executed. Entire villages were massacred in retaliation for resistance activity. But despite the risks, the resistance didn't stop. Their courage helped pave the way for D-Day and the ultimate collapse of Nazi Germany. And though their victories weren't always on the front pages or battlefield maps, their impact was immense, woven into the very heart of how World War II was won. The goal was to destroy German industry and infrastructure, but also to break the morale of the civilian population. By 1942, the United States Army Air Forces USAF joined the bombing efforts with a different philosophy. Daylight precision bombing of military and industrial targets using heavily armed B-17 Flying Fortresses and B-24 Liberators. The RAF bombed at night, and the Americans bombed during the day, forming what became known as the Combined Bomber Offensive. Cities like Hamburg, Cologne, and Berlin were subjected to massive aerial bombardment. One of the most devastating attacks was Operation Gomorrah in July 1943, where Hamburg was firebombed for 8 consecutive days. The resulting firestorm destroyed entire neighborhoods and killed an estimated 40,000 people. Similarly, the bombing of Dresden in February 1945 remains one of the most controversial actions of the war. The RAF and USAF dropped thousands of tons of explosives and incendiaries, creating a firestorm that engulfed the city center and caused tens of thousands of civilian deaths. While these bombing campaigns crippled German industrial output, they also raised ethical questions about the targeting of civilian areas. Precision was often difficult to achieve with the technology of the time, and entire cities were razed in the process of targeting factories, rail yards, or military installations. Oil refineries, ball-bearing plants, aircraft factories, and transportation hubs were prime targets. And by 1944, the Allies had severely limited Germany's ability to produce fuel and transport supplies. Despite high losses among bomber crews, especially before the widespread use of long-range fighter escorts like the P-51 Mustang, the strategic bombing campaign forced Germany to divert significant resources to anti-aircraft defenses, fighter planes, and repairing damaged infrastructure. By the end of the war, many German cities were in ruins, and the Luftwaffe was largely grounded due to a lack of fuel and aircraft. The Allied bombing campaigns remain a subject of historical debate, balancing the military necessity of defeating Nazi Germany with the humanitarian consequences of civilian casualties and urban destruction. Nevertheless, these operations significantly contributed to the weakening of the Third Reich and the eventual Allied victory in Europe. Resistance movements and espionage in occupied Europe. As Nazi control tightened its grip, resistance movements began to form. It's quiet at first, scattered and improvised.